Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The legendary Midwest Book Review has called Barbara Fradkin a master of the genre, and the Globe and Mail has promised that for those who like solid classic mystery with added character, Inspector Green is perfect. First introduced in Do or Die, which the Canadian Book Review found to be full of interesting characters, plenty of local color, and a clever plot that keeps readers guessing, while Storyteller magazine assured fans that Once Upon a Time is so much more than a mystery. It's a story about people pushed to the edge, about families, about desperation, and about love. Rarely does one find such depth in a novel of any type, and the Ottawa Citizen declared that Mistwalker was the gold standard for the series. Inspector Green continued to be a hit with fans over new volumes like The Fifth Son, Honor Among Men, where the Hamilton Spectator concluded that Fradkin weaves a complex problem into the novel that works on two levels, as a mystery and as a spotlight on a serious Canadian social problem, while the Sherbrooke Record sang the praises of both Dream Chasers as an insightful, nuanced, and entertaining and might as well be the best novel to date, and This Thing of Darkness, which they deemed a fine tale that characteristically raises profound social issues. Green continued to keep readers happy with new cases he cracked in Beautiful Lie the Dead, The Whisper of Legends, where Publishers Weekly celebrated a well-written page-turner with a pace as fast as the current of the famous Nahanni River. None So Blind, which the National Post discovered upon first read, was rooted in the fundamentals of telling a good crime story, creating worlds we want to spend time in, populated by characters, main and supporting, that we are compelled to care about. And most recently with The Devil to Play. The Library Journal, meanwhile, has praised a rapid read Cedric O'Toole series featuring The Fall Guy, Evil Behind the Door, The Night Thief, and Blood Ties as an outstanding collection, while they point out that a Romana Descent series has proved equally popular with readers who have enjoyed Barbara Fradkin's series featuring Inspector Green of the Ottawa Police. They will not be disappointed with their new protagonist. While critics went crazy for Fire in the Stars, the Winnipeg Free Press celebrating as a terrific read, the Toronto Star raving that it was masterly, while Kirkus Reviews promised that The Trickster's Lullaby had a diabolical plot. And frequent fan Publishers Weekly was impressed with the way Fradkin combines a white-knuckle mystery with a look at a serious social problem of foreign worker exploitation. Along with more recent sequels, The Ancient Dead and Wreck Bay most recently. Barbara, welcome. Thanks so much for being here. We understand your house was literally lined with books growing up. How young do you first remember reading them?
Very young, because I was one of those people that was in a house of books. My father was a university professor of philosophy, but he was a great lover of books, and he bought books all the time. He read everything vociferously, great novels, history, science, philosophy, you name it, memoirs. And so whenever he ran out of room in the house, he just built another bookshelf along one of the walls. So we had hallways that were about 2 feet wide with bookshelves on either side. And his study was 4 walls of bookshelves. And we had books everywhere. And there weren't a lot of children's books in those days, at least that I was aware of. My parents took me to the library and I could pick what I wanted out of there, but I spent a lot of time just kind of poking around in the millions of books we had in the house. And I'd pick one up and I'd read a few sentences. And if I could understand it, I'd carry on. If it grabbed my interest, I carried on. So I read some really strange things when I was fairly young. Preteen, I was reading things like Tennessee Williams and Walt Faulkner and stuff. I don't know what I got out of them, frankly, but I remember reading them and thinking, this is cool. And my father was a great lover of Russian novelists, and in particular, the Soviet dissidents that were, of course, around at that time. So I was reading, in addition to Dostoevsky, I was reading Solzhenitsyn. I remember vividly, I had to write a book report for grade 6 class. I don't know what that is in the United States, but we're about 11 at that age. And I said I was going to write it on One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn. And the teacher said, do you know how to spell that? I said, oh, yes, I read it. Anyway, so I remember that because she was absolutely floored. So there was just this love of reading. But you also mentioned imaginary friends. And I think authors essentially have stories spinning in their heads. That's why we write them down, because they're in there and they want to come out. And it comes initially from a tremendous imagination where you surround yourself with much more exciting things than your own life, which is usually very humdrum. I lived in a nice, safe house in a nice, safe neighborhood, and I went to school and I never had any real problems, you know, the odd bully and stuff, but nothing as exciting as I could dream up in my own imagination.
So you began telling stories of your own while still a child too?
I had friends, I had real friends, but I had even cooler imaginary friends.
Did you already see that as a professional path for yourself back then?
Not really. It was more of a creative outlet and a fun thing to do in my time off or spare time. I was going to go to university. I was going to become something. I knew that. That was the path that was always charted for our family. So I went on and I studied psychology, got a doctorate in psychology, and became a clinical psychologist. And that's what I did for a real living to make money, such as it was. And I knew that, I mean, you're right, that one of the beautiful things about being a writer is that it could be an add-on to any other kind of life. You can write about your life in whatever other thing you do. It doesn't make much money. Most people don't make much money. And I think if you're going to write for the money, you're going to miss out on being able to tell the kinds of stories you would really love to tell. So I'm much happier actually telling the stories I want to tell, but not thinking, oh, I have to make X amount of dollars or I won't be able to pay the mortgage.
The Globe and Mail, in their first read of your work, promised that for those who like a solid classic mystery with added character, Inspector Green is perfect. Going back in time to when you first conjured up the Ottawa police detective Michael Green and put him on the case in Do or Die, which the Midwest Book Review complimented as a stunningly well-written novel. Where did you pull from your career as a clinical psychologist in crafting this character and story?
I'm actually a child psychologist, and I work for, most of the time I worked in a school board type setting as is kind of feel like a first mental health responder type thing. So I was kind of I saw a broad range of kinds of issues and problems, which really informed my writing in terms of types of people, you know, meeting different kinds of people, hearing their stories, and that kind of thing. But I started to write other things before I wrote crime fiction. I fiddled around with slice of life, literary, so-called literary. I wrote plays, just whatever struck my fancy because it was just fun. But when I was writing my doctoral thesis, if anybody, you know, people who've written a scientific thesis, you'll know they're dry as dust. They are dull. They have to be. They're very fact-oriented, just the facts, ma'am type thing. So, but that's not really my nature to spend a whole year writing something really dry and dusty, analyzing the research I'd done. And so I started to put little comments in the discussion section about that were more anecdotal and had a little bit of humor in them and kind of showed a human side to the story, the stuff I was discovering. And every single time my thesis advisor would take it out with a red pen, mark it out, write, this is not appropriate for a scientific dissertation. I kept on doing it because I kind of enjoyed doing it and I knew he'd take it out and whatever. In the end, he was just drawing a sad face in the margin, at which point I started to think, I could kill somebody. That's what I could do. I could write a murder mystery. I love reading them. I read many different kinds of books, but I did enjoy mysteries. So Inspector Green just sort of walked on stage as a fun aside to writing my dissertation. But once I started to write, I discovered that murder really wasn't funny for me. It was something very serious. It involved people in pain and people whose lives are destroyed or turned upside down and who've gone to very dark places and that kind of thing. And I found, as a psychologist, that really grasped me. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I can't write light, funny stuff about mystery that are mysteries, but I can use my interest in people to tell really fascinating stories in a way. You know, a crime story is really the murder is really the dramatic device, isn't it? It's kind of the thing around which you spin a story of relationships and struggles and heroism, and hope and despair, and all those other kind of really primal emotions, which stories are all about. So I just discovered that this was a great way to meld my two loves, psychology and writing. I actually don't know my characters well when I start. I don't, and I never tried to plot a mystery, to be honest. I don't plot as a rule. I still don't plot. I'm one of those sort of fly by the seat of your pants writers who I do start anticipating ahead now a little bit more, but I still don't. I plunge in when I have a toehold in the story, and I meet the characters as I go along, and I ask myself questions about them as I'm going along. And so Green was very much of a, he was a fun guy to create. That's all I can say. I made a lot of rookie mistakes and I didn't know it was going to be a series. I didn't know I was going to write this thing, get it published or anything. So I just wrote a character that I enjoyed interacting with and keeping in touch with. A little bit like me, a little bit like my late husband. It was just a melding of the slightly rebellious, hates authority, hates paperwork, all those things that are me, plus my husband, but determined, because that's the nature of a police detective in a series. They have to go head first into something and keep going when other people would perhaps take the easy way out. And thought to myself, well, now I have to make sure that it's accurate. I had made all the police stuff up. I watched and read lots of books, but they were either British or American. They weren't Canadian. And the procedures are different. So I asked a police guy, I contacted the community liaison person for the police and said, is there anybody that you can suggest that could read this manuscript for me and make sure I haven't got things egregiously wrong? And a guy got back to me, I don't know, a week later, constable, said he'd love to do it, and he did, and he was really great. And he's in fact been with me for all 11 Inspector Green books. He's retired now, but he loves this little side job, which he does voluntarily. I don't have the money to pay him, and he doesn't seem to ever want anything except a bottle of rum or something like that. And so he's read everyone, and he corrected some things which I hadn't realized were the case. The rank is wrong. For example, inspectors in the Ottawa police force and in most Canadian forces are they're administrators higher up. They're not going to be frontline guys, unlike the British system where the inspector is the one who's actually out doing the interrogations and following up leads. But I wanted my guy to do that. But I wanted him to be an inspector because that was a cooler title than detective. So I put this interesting little tension into him, and that he had almost gotten promoted beyond the rank he really wanted to be at. And now he wanted to get back into the field, and he kept meddling with his sergeant who was doing the actual supposed investigating and running off and doing other things, but because he was the boss after all. So he could do that, but he wasn't supposed to. So that was a fun little tension that I put into it.
How long did you work on this first novel before you finally saw it published?
The process actually took two parts because life intervened. I got my degree, I got a full-time job, I had 3 small children and a house to run and all of that. So the book kind of sat in collecting dust for quite a long time after it was written in its initial draft phase. And normally that's all I ever did with books, is I wrote them and then I put them away, and that was the end of them. I never went back to rewrite and think that maybe I could make this good enough to be published. It wasn't until I started meeting other crime writers in a crime writing group and started writing short stories with them and having people say, well, this stuff is good. You should try getting something published. That I thought, well, maybe I should drag out that manuscript and have a look at it. And so that's what I did. And I reworked it, brought it up to speed with the help of my critiquing group, sent it off to a publisher. And I remember the shock when they bought it, because, it hurt stories. Even Louise Penny, who talks about having gotten 19 rejection letters I always thought, boy, some editor is going to get killed for that mistake. But anyway, so and you know, other guys who were selling books out of the back of their car because that was all that was the best they could do. So I wasn't expecting the first publisher I sent it to buy it, but she did.
Storyteller magazine assured readers that Once Upon a Time is so much more than a mystery. It's a story about people being pushed to the edge, about families in desperation, about love. Rarely does one find such depth in a novel of any type. How did you want to use these elements to evolve the series in this next novel?
Yes. Well, in fact, I had written Once Upon a Time in its early draft as a follow-up prior to selling this one. But Once Upon a Time was a more hard-hitting book than Do or Die. So I didn't want it to go first. I ran it by the publisher and she agreed with me that, yeah, we should put the Do or Die one as the introduction and then follow up with Once Upon a Time. So by that time I was quite familiar, but I still do things along as the series evolves. The character evolves, as he should, you know, as all the characters do. So I throw all kinds of trouble his way, and I have things happen to him that add depth and different perspectives to him.
We look forward to bringing you Barbara's full episode on an upcoming season on a streaming network, but for now we're excited to talk with her about her latest releases. Let's introduce viewers who haven't met her to former aid worker Amanda Doucette, who anchors a series of her own that first blazed to life on the page in Fire in the Stars, which the Winnipeg Free Press called a terrific read, and Inside Toronto called fabulous, raving that the characters were amazing and the story pulled you in and kept you guessing till the end, while the Toronto Star focused in on their opinion that it's the wilderness that provides the story's passion. What elements, looking back, were key to making Amanda, her trusty dog Kaylee, and Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer Chris Timko work for you on the page here?
This one was much more deliberate in the sense that I knew certain things you needed to have in a series character to make them successful. As first of all, you needed to have a kind of character who's an amateur sleuth but dives in to solve crimes. That's a pretty weird thing. Most people would pick up the phone and call 911. So you needed a certain kind of character who would do that. So that was my first question. Why would somebody be that way inclined? What would motivate them to do that? So the whole issue of motivation of why they would do that came to mind. Plus, they needed to be resilient, independent, stubborn, determined, all the things that would keep them going when they really ought to have handed over to the people that knew what they were doing. But the motivation was what was troubling me. I also wanted this series to be a traveling series, like just for fun. I wanted, having spent 10 years in Ottawa doing an Ottawa-based story, I wanted to explore the rest of the country. And Nahanni book, The Whisper of Legends, had been so much fun, and people had loved traveling to another part of Canada. So I wanted to explore all the aspects of Canada, which is a very, very big and diverse country, which most Canadians don't know that much about, actually. So I knew I wanted her to move from place to place. And so I needed some kind of a job that she would do that would allow her to do that. But most important, where would the need to do this kind of stuff come from? Why the motivation to keep doing it? In a single series, like not a series, but in a standalone, you can have your amateur sleuth have a personal stake in something, like she's accused of the crime, or her best friend is murdered and the cops don't know who did it. There's a lot of, but it has to be you can't do that book after book after book. It gets a little thin after a while. So I needed a kind of what would you call it? A theme of redemption, I guess, to run through her story. And I didn't know what it would be until I heard about the schoolgirls in northern Africa, in northern Nigeria, who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. It was around 2014, just when I was thinking about this book, the first book. And it was very much in the news. But what was in the news was things like what the government was failing to do, and what the Boko Haram were likely to do, and how the guards had turned tail and things like that. But all writers look behind the headlines, right? We read a little snippet and we say, but what about? And we ask a question that's lesser known. And in my case, the question was, what about the people who couldn't save the children? The teachers, the villagers, the aid workers. And I thought, aha, there's the perfect thing she can be. And that will give her a fear, which would drive her back to Canada, because she'd been traumatized, but she needed to kind of, she had a bit of a savior complex, if you like. She needed to fix this, having not managed to save these kids. She wanted to help other people who were in trouble. So that's where that character came from. And once I got her and I knew all these other elements about her, she needed to be a survivor. She needed to be resilient, independent, resourceful, have a certain level of skill. And an aid worker would have that, things like first aid, emergency training, making something out of nothing. Because in the third world, or developing world, sorry, they have you're often making do with very little. It's fun. It's very liberating to write a non-police procedural, for one thing, because she doesn't have to follow any rules. She's always doing something she's not supposed to be doing, essentially. And you don't have to worry about evidence collection and cautioning suspects. And, she's not supposed to walk up to the door and knock on a door and say, tell me about where you were such and such a time, as a cop can do, but she can find out in more devious ways. And that's fun too. All of this creativity that you can throw in with this, as you say, broader type of a canvas. But the beauty of these books too is that I traveled to every place that I wrote about. I never write without having set foot there, spent some time there, tried to do the various things that Amanda did, other than investigating murders, obviously. But I spent 3 weeks in Newfoundland, driving up and down, hiking, going in the ocean is at that point is not someplace you'd swim for longer than 30 seconds, but went out on a boat and everything, whale watching and that kind of thing, to see it from the ocean, and encountered moose, and it was really fun, just walking around, because you want a sense of the place. You want to see and see the little details that make it come to life. Because my writing, I like it to be very much of a draw the reader into the adventure, or into they're almost walking along with the character. So it's very experiential. In other words, I don't write in intellectual kind of a way. I like people to be drawn into the story. And I think the setting is so important to being able to do that. So you picture where you are, you see things, you hear things, you smell things, etc. The police cop, the RCMP guy, Chris Timko, had actually been in the Nahanni book. He was one I moved over because I needed an RCMP cop, and I thought, well, I liked him the first time I created him, and they move around, they get posted elsewhere, so I'll bring him into this book, and then I won't have to think about that character too much. He, of course, evolved over the course of the series. The other guy was a lot of fun to write about. And the other thing you do when you've got an amateur sleuth is you need sidekicks that fill in the gaps for them in various ways. So Chris Timko could offer to some extent as a liaison with the cops, or find out information, or tell her what they would do next, or whatever. And her other sidekick, Matthew, was an old style journalist who had contacts all around the world and knew his way around a computer, knew his way around searches, and could find out just about anything. He could even go down on the dark web. He knew all the tricks of the trade of tracking down information. So that was useful. That was what they brought to the book in terms of writerly tricks that I needed.
What can fans of the series look forward to within the latest release, Wreck Bay?
I often love putting history into the books. In fact, the brand new one I've just got coming out now, Wreck Bay, which is just out in the US this week, I think. It's the mystery goes all the way back to the 1960s, 70s, to the hippie communes and the American Vietnam War draft dodgers of that era. And that to me creates a whole layer of mystery and interest. It allows, because you've got the old story that you're telling, the historical story, and the modern day mystery that you're telling as well. And so it creates a really fun interwoven story. And yes, Ancient Dead, I mean, the whole idea of it being a historical story was primarily because that's the land of the dinosaur bones. The Ancient Dead is written in the Badlands of Alberta, which is where the major dinosaur finds have occurred. And so, for a writer, you think bones. Ooh, there can be other kinds of bones buried there. And then you start asking yourself, why? Who are they? Where did they come from? How long have they been there? And you create your story. With Wreck Bay, in some ways, I saw it as a 5-book arc. And as an aside, I should say that having written 4 Amanda books, I got a lot of pressure from readers who wanted Green back too. So it wasn't that the publisher wanted him, but the readers, I had people who loved him. They like Amanda and they're okay with it, but they wanted more of him too. So now I've been juggling both series, which is kind of challenging, but fun. When I get sick of one, I go to the other one. But so where was I with regard? Yeah, so I envisioned it as a 5-book arc from the East Coast to the West Coast of Canada. So Newfoundland is the farthest east it could be, and the middle ones, and then Vancouver Island, where Wreck Bay takes place, is the farther west of Canada. And I thought that might be the end of the series. And it could conceivably end at that point, but there's also the other ocean, the Arctic Ocean, and the whole area to the north, which I haven't covered, which would be my next move if I went there. Yes.
Readers had a reunion with Inspector Green recently in The Devil to Play. Who are you looking most forward to meeting back up with here? Be it Green or his fellow cops or daughter Hannah, now a cop herself, having followed Dad into the family business.
Well, certainly easy to walk into the room and know many of the characters. So you start spinning the story from a knowledge point of view. But I also was aware that 7 years had passed since the last book was published. And it was 7 years in real time. So some time had to pass in their fictional lives as well. So I also thought it was time to update the series a little bit. A lot had happened in our real life in that 7 years. For one thing, I retired and I'd gotten all these Amanda books out, but in that time, there were a lot of social things that went on in the world. There was the Me Too movement, there was Black Lives Matter movement, there was a lot of social equity movements that have raised their heads, protest movements of various kinds. And I felt as if I wanted to address that a little bit, the whole issue of I wanted a woman to feature more prominently, and I wanted youth to feature more prominently. For one thing, all the other guys are getting a bit long in the tooth. Green was stuck out in some kind of a dead end type of a job out in administration, and the other guys were getting on too. And I wanted some fresher, newer blood. So I brought in his daughter, Green's daughter, as a rookie constable. And I also introduced a young male detective, general detective, not just getting his foot on the first rung of the ladder. And he was of a mixed race type thing. So I was trying to look at the fact that our police force is increasingly looking at diversity. I think all police forces are. And that So I added a little bit of that, and so I have two young investigators as well as the old timers. So it's a very different dynamic. And Green wasn't supposed to be involved at all. I mean, he obviously, the book was about him partly, but he wasn't in charge of major crimes anymore. He was doing something else, and he wasn't supposed to be meddling around. But of course, this is Inspector Green, so of course he was. So that was kind of fun, having the play of the young and the old, and the fact that Green was going to have to do it slightly outside of what he was supposed to be doing.
So it sounds like Green's back in action. As we understand, you're actually already almost done with another new book in the series?
I don't have a title for it yet. I'm puzzling about that. Titles are things that come to me at some point in the writing of the book. Sometimes it's a phrase that you write and you think, oh, that's the perfect title. Sometimes you get to the end and you go, it doesn't have a title, so it's not finished. The title is kind of like the cherry on the top of the sundae. It finishes it, and if it's not there, it doesn't pull the thing together. So I'm still working on the title idea, but it's going to be about a woman who at the beginning of the book is found dead in an alleyway, and she's nobody knows who she is. Her identity is, there's no ID or anything, but they decide that she's probably Russian. She's a new immigrant. And so they're trying to find out who she is, and it connects back to Ukraine and some of the interesting past of, that's as far as I want to go into it, but we're just getting started on that one.
Before we go, what stayed your happiest space within all that comes with being a novelist over the past 3 decades to keep you wanting to get up and do it newly each day?
What gets me excited is the momentum of the story, of getting the next part out. If it's not going well, I'm usually tearing my hair out and not happy one little bit. But usually I find that if you insist on keeping at it, like you just sit down and start writing, whether you're ready to or not, just start a scene, start a conversation, a dialogue or something, start them driving down the road, going somewhere. Usually the story will evolve and you'll find your feet and your momentum, and then it's exciting. So it's not an automatic thing. I usually drift into my book, my morning of writing. I try to write every day. If you don't, it's very easy to never finish a book. So part of it is the discipline of forcing yourself to write, whether you're in the mood or not, and making sure you put in a minimum amount of time. Sometimes it goes longer than that, but as far as every other wanting other people to well, there are a lot of parts of that answer. First of all, they have to be big readers. Read, but don't read just anything. Read the best of everything. So the best crime writers, the best literary writers. Try to look at how they tell stories and how they create characters. I never mentioned this in the creation of Amanda, but you have to create, I think one of the primary things about creating a book that people want to read is to create a character that people can care about. There has to be, if you don't like any of the characters in the book, you're not going to read the book. So you need some kind of sympathy or caring or at least fascination with what is going to happen to this person. So that's the other thing I would have them think about, is what kind of character you really want to read about and tell a story about that other people might be interested in.
Barbara, it's been a pleasure talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.